I'm Robin Abad, one of your film festival producers, and just want to thank all the family and friends who are here tonight. So, just going to say a few words of introduction for our esteemed panelists. We're so excited that you folks could join us tonight. To my far right is Jeff Howe, Professor Jeff Howe, who is a professor of landscape architecture at the University of Washington and the co-editor of City Unsilenced, Urban Resistance and Public Space in the Age of Shrinking Democracy, published by Routledge in 2017. Jeff, thank you for being here. Next to Jeff is Angela Washington, a journalist and a newspaper reporter, talk show host, and subject of the Women's March film, one of the subjects in the Women's March film. Personal inspiration, also. If I could tag that onto your title, Angela. And then to my immediate right is Chris Carlsson, a writer, editor, and historian, and the co-founder of Critical Mass. So, folks, thank you so much for coming. So we've got, there's a few lines of investigation or inquiry, I think, that we can pose to our panelists. So I've got a couple ideas, and then we're going to open it up to all of you, who I know there are folks who probably are really excited to engage in this conversation. Oh, sorry, how's that? Is that better? It's like over here. All right, wandering mic. So something that really struck me about all of the films is the different types of protest and celebration that happen and that occur. You know, there are gatherings, there are marches, there are other forms of making a statement and trying to make a point, as we saw with the third film about murals in Ciudad Juarez. And so I know that, Jeff, this is something that you've thought about a lot, is sort of resistance at different scales, both scales of time and space, size of gatherings, and the different formats that protest and celebration, that happens in.
Yes, we as panelists, we had the chance to actually watch a film beforehand, and one thing that really struck me when I watched this earlier this week is the variety of ways that individuals and collective can be engaged in some form of resistance. And it could be at the scale of kind of one single individual. I think the hardware shop, like the person and what she wears and how she expresses herself is a form of resistance, right? To Women's March, hundreds and thousands of people on the streets, all over the globe, and then the two artists in Ciudad Juarez, painting murals, and that's another form of kind of resistance. And the fact that they said that they wanted something that can stay longer than just a momentary protest. And I was just taken back by the number of ways that individuals and collective can be engaged, and also the kind of the temporal scale that these different films begin to touch upon. I think Chris, the critical mass is a kind of ephemeral thing that happens, like once a month, but has been going on for 30 years, right? And so the temporality and doesn't mean that it's going to disappear. And then the Women's March, even though it's just one day, but just look at what we have accomplished with our midterm election, right? And so it has this shifting scale is something that I think is really profound, that's embodied in this collection.
Yeah, I think we saw a blue wave come through in these last midterm elections. I'm convinced this is just a tiny lap on the shore of what's going to be a giant blue tsunami coming in 2020. So it's up to all of us to keep up the wave action. There's a moment in the Women's March film, Angela, where you're sitting at your computer just before you and your daughter are about to head out. Maya's also here in the audience. Maya, where are you? Maya Washington's in the audience. And you're seeing all of the other marches all over the world There's something like 280 separate marches in over 80 countries around the world participated in this one-day Women's March. And it's something that, that moved you to tears. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, as somebody who helped pull that film together, and who was out there marching with all these other women, knowing that there are other activities happening in parallel all over the world. What does that mean? How does that feel?
It felt amazing. I must say that I chose to do the march for personal reasons. I was thinking about my daughter. I was thinking about my son. What this all meant to us, and then watching, sitting there at the computer before we left, I saw this is not just about us. This is about all of us. And to see, I thought, okay, a couple of thousand people will be out, but to see millions of people, it blew me away. It affected me. And I realized that this is not going to be just a march that happens. There are going to be repercussions. It's going to be a wave, as you said. We're going to make changes now. What are we looking at? The Year of the Woman. We have 31 new congresswomen, and they're all first term congresswomen. 1992 was supposed to be the Year of the Woman. No, 2018 is the Year of the Woman. We are making changes. We are going to make changes. We are going to be noticed. We are going to take things back.
Yes, yes. So, speaking of taking things back, we were talking a little bit earlier this week about how each of these films moved us, and Angela, you said something about needing to take it back to the 60s. And it just taking protests, taking, the ways that we're putting ourselves out there, teaching young people about,
We do. We need to I look at the young people who are out there protesting gun violence and how they're approaching things. But I think about, old school 60s protesters and the fact that they knew that one protest was not going to be enough. They were going to have to organize. They were going to have to be diligent and continue to do it. That's what we need to teach our young people. We need to let them know that it's going to be a hard, long road, and one protest, one thing is not going to be enough. We got to keep doing it. It has to keep going and going and going. Talk to your young people. Teenagers, little kids, let them know that if they want to create change, this is how they're going to have to do it. Educate them.
Yeah. I think that really comes through in Misha's film in particular. There's
absolutely.
Yeah, so many of the other subjects in the film talked about how incredible it was to see families and young people out there, and there were young college age, high school age people sort of talking about their experience and why they perceive this to be an important way to engage in democracy.
We're in the pouring rain. I figured, these people are going to go home. But nobody went home. Yeah. Everybody was so determined to be there. And, you've got strollers with plastic on top of them, and dads with their kids on their shoulders. It was so amazing. And I was with my daughter.
Yes. So tonight's program is titled, Tonight's program is titled Protest and Celebration in Our Shared Spaces, and I think there was one sign in the Women's March film that said something like public spaces equal our spaces. And I know, Chris, this is something that you have thought about a lot in leading bike tours and bringing people around the city to sort of reflect on history in public space. So why public space? Why not just donating to things while you're home, on your computer online? And what is it about gathering and being together out in the public commons that is critical and important, and means that we're building something sustainable?
Well, I think the films really illustrate the fact that there's an awful lot of invisibility in our culture, that huge swaths of the population are rendered invisible. Great numbers of things that really matter to us are systematically made invisible. And when you come out in public and make a point of demonstrating and connecting with other people, you render it less invisible. Obviously, that's the easy part. The difficult part is to actually reanimate a public life. We live in a culture that has elevated private life over everything for a very long time. And it's essentially put the value of everything in terms of private ownership, private investment, private initiative. You as an individual should fix your life. If you're poor or you're suffering or anything's wrong, it's your fault. There's no such thing as society. I mean, Margaret Thatcher famously came out and said that in the early 80s, you know. And then, of course, Tina, there is no alternative. This world, this narrow, bitter world in which you're supposed to just fend for yourself, is all we're really left with as the option. And the spectacle keeps repeating it over and over and over again. You're on your own. Take care of yourself. Take care of your own. Screw everybody else. Obviously, the answer, the antidote, is to recognize that we live a life in common, that we produce this world in common every day with the work we do. Much of it we should stop because we're actually destroying the planet, but separate conversation. But the fact is we don't talk about it. We don't have a place to discuss it because there's no public sphere left to us anymore. It's been taken away. It's been commodified. If you're not out shopping, if you're not out buying something, a commodity of one sort or another, an entertainment commodity, going to the bar and buying a drink, you have no place to talk, no place to meet, no place to think about the world you're in. So our efforts with early critical mass was very much about, beyond bicycling, to create a public space, and uniquely a public space in motion, moving through the streets, re-inhabiting the urban environment on a different logic, on a different basis. And these huge demonstrations that have taken place, and even the small demonstrations that take place pretty much daily around here, are really vital, because when you come upon them, you go to the front of the picket lines in front of the hotels right now, and you see people putting their lives on the line and really making their point in a very dramatic way. And that's how you get solidarity. Without being in public, you're not going to be in a situation where solidarity is even possible. So public space is sort of the essential element that leads to a discussion of the public sphere. And the public sphere is in demise. And it's really crucial that we take it back and reanimate it and expand it, not just from the point of view of being able to blab with each other, but to make life together as a public reality. We do make it that way anyway, but we can't recognize it because we have no place to really refer back to that common experience. So we make life in common. It's time to share the wealth of that life that we make in common as well.
Yeah. Well, one of the big things I think that comes through is that through all of these shared experiences, we're creating memories, and they're shared memories. And in the case of the Women's March, you're almost sharing a memory with the entire world, because this phenomenon, this event, this collective movement is all happening literally at the same time. Certainly, that's something that I took away from writing with critical mass for many years. I don't get out there as much as I used to. Maybe we don't need it anymore because we've got so many bike lanes in San Francisco. I don't know.
I mean, let me just jump in on that point. The bike lanes here suck really bad. They've been taken over by Uber and Lyft, and we have a disaster of 35,000 new cars a day coming into the city without any public policy dealing with this, a complete failure of public policy. But that's not really what I want to talk about. I wanted to mention this point that you just brought up about memory, which was what led to the creation of Shaping San Francisco back in the mid-90s. But the fact is we live in an amnesiac culture. We are not left with a lack of memory by accident. It's on purpose. And of course, the destruction of public education is at the heart of that process. Even when we had public education, the historical education was quite poor. And so we've been contesting that actually for decades now. And it's really kind of a vital part of our lives. And we cannot understand how much different life could be if we can't understand how the fuck it got like this. And it didn't happen by accident. There's a lot of specific things that led to this moment. And to really untangle that past and pull it apart and to hold the memories of our own lives is a key part of that. Most of us don't think of ourselves as historical actors, but we make history every day. We're making history right now in this conversation. And that's really important, to start exercising that muscle and own your own historical agency. Because by doing that, and it's done by going out to demonstrations, but it's done in all sorts of very small ways in everyday life, we actually could really alter the texture of life in a really meaningful way and start making the world we want to be in and not just receiving it as victims and as sort of helplessly out of control facing the world that we're stuck with instead of the one we chose. Maybe you guys want to chime in?
Yeah. Okay, so militancy is still important then? Yeah, I don't know.
Yes.
Jeff, your eyes are twinkling. I didn't know if you had anything to say about that, but yeah. So, all right. So militancy is important. It's clear that it's still important for us to be out there in the streets when we're angry, when we see what this administration is doing and how choices that are being made are negatively affecting so many people who are already vulnerable and disenfranchised. I think there's another side to this too, though, which does come through again with critical mass, and I think people certainly felt it when they were out there marching in the Women's March. I know I feel it when I ride my bike in the San Francisco Pride Parade, and that there's something celebratory also about being all out together, even if we're out there because we're angry, and we're out there to resist. There's also something about being together, which I know, Jeff, in your recent book, The City Unsilenced, you coined this term, the protestival. And I wonder...
I didn't coin that.
Okay, you didn't coin the term.
I used it.
You used the term. All right. I'm attributing it to you, but nonetheless, protestival is something that comes up a lot, and I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit. We're out there because we're angry, because we're directing a lot of negative emotion towards change. But there's also another dynamic that's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the reason why this term protestival came up is that I think what we do as protesters on the street is not only to kind of express anger, but also to create a space of hope, right? That you both said in your film that you want to change the world, right? And it's a hopeful thing to say. It's not because it's not because you want the future of the world to be an angry one, but to be a hopeful one, and so combining street protests with a form of kind of celebration, celebrating human life, celebrating diversity, celebrating the kind of creativity of kind of individuals and communities, and that creates a space that I think is invitational, as Chris has said it. It welcomes others to join, to create a common, rather than just a form of fighting against something else, but an invitation for others to participate. And I think that's what you see in some of the instances in the film that shown tonight.
I mean, we use the term for critical mass that it was bicycling's defiant celebration. And I think the celebratory aspect of it has always been really front and center. But to go beyond that obvious point now, but just talk a little bit about the vitality of pleasure in our activities that we do in community spaces and in public space together is vital, because so much of the left for decades and decades was about sacrifice, suffering, and kind of coming from this neo-Christian point of view. And frankly, I'm an atheist. I'm not into that. I don't want to suffer. I want to enjoy life. I want life to be much better than it is. And to start from always the premise that, we have to fight, bad, negative. It's like, yeah, I get it. There's lots of things to be pissed off about. I'm pissed off about an enormous range of things. Don't get me started. But that's not going to convince anybody who's on the other side of any of those questions. That's what we can be quite sure that if you go into a situation, and this happened all the time, and it's one of the beauties of critical mass, is that we had this live experiment month after month where we would be in confrontation with people on the streets, either motorists or pedestrians, whoever, and they'd be like sometimes really happy for us going by and cheering, other times they'd be angry and yelling at us or whatever, but you'd have a moment where you had to work it out with them. And for thousands of people across the planet for 2 decades or more now, they've worked it out. And in that heat of the moment, what's really wins those people over is not yelling at them and calling them names and putting them down, but recognizing their humanity and inviting them into a process with you. And that's what I think we have to be better at going forward. We've been getting better at it for a long time now. I mean, the Occupy movement was very invitational. A lot of the things, the women's movement was super invitational, women's marches and all that stuff that's gone on since then. So this is kind of, I think, the real, the balm that both, you know, it melts the hardness, melts the antagonism to some extent. Doesn't always win, because there's a lot of idiots that we have to deal with. But there's a chance for a lot of the people who are somewhat, you know, haven't made up their mind entirely, if you can actually present them with an option for having a better life, a better time, a better social experience, a better ongoing day-to-day engagement with the world around them, that's going to win them over. Much more likely than just yelling at them and treating them as though they're the entrenched enemy. So that's what I think is kind of at the heart of a politics of pleasure that should be really at the sort of in the core of how we present ourselves to the world.
For some reason, I can't get my mind out of the 60s. And this idea that, you know, there was a certain kind of militancy to the civil rights movement that emerged in the 60s that we're having to revive. And something else about that I feel like is also really congruent with the way that we're engaging with democracy and activism now is that the movement seems to be so intersectional. And this is something that, Angela, you and I have talked about a lot, where, you know, it is a women's march. The focus is our women's rights and the disenfranchisement and marginalization of women. But when you're out there, you see Black Lives Matter signs, you see anti-gun violence signs, you see, you know, you see LGBT pride showing itself, allies coming forward to sort of march in solidarity around women's issues. And then when you're at a Black Lives Matter march, you know, you see a similar sort of composition in the types of signs and the kinds of messages and the things that are sort of bringing people there in allyship. And I wonder if, Angela, you could expand on some of that thinking we had earlier.
Well, you know you're not alone. This is an opportunity for you. You look out and you see someone who looks like you, who has the same opinion that you do. It makes you brave. It's like, oh, I can talk to her about that. I can talk to him about that. It lets you know that you can get your point across. You have someone in your corner who's going to be with you, who's going to fight this fight with you. What's the term? It takes a village. It does. It takes a village. You get to, when you come together, you've come together for you know, something that's a negative reason, but the positivity and the growth that you get from it's amazing. You walk away. I'll tell you a story. We did the march. We were soaking wet after, and we're on the bus and we're starving, and we decide we want burritos. And we're talking about burritos. 10 people who got off the bus with us to go and get burritos because we're having a conversation about burritos. That might seem like something small, but after going through what we did that day, it's like, I'm going to come together and we're going to come around. And nothing brings you together like food. You've just walked around in the rain and now let's go stuff your face with a burrito. I mean, it may seem small, but think about a young kid who's, you know, trying to decide, you know, I don't know, you know, if I'm gay or not, but he or she sees all of these amazing people out here who are proud of who they are, and she makes the decision, yeah, I've got somebody supporting me. That's what this is about. It shows you've got support.
Awesome. Protest and burritos. I can't think of anything more San Franciscan.
Hey.
That's how we do it here.
They're very good burritos, too.
Just as long as you're biking between those two things, you've got it all covered. Well, so I think we're going to open it up.
She's been trying to raise her hand forever.
All right, Susie.
Hi. So, Robin, you kind of started to talk about this, but I also wonder a little bit about, you guys are talking about protestivals and bringing people in, and I think the Women's March, I helped shoot a little bit of that. So that was angry but celebratory. But I am wondering a little bit about something like Black Lives Matter marches and the protests in the street that maybe aren't sanctioned the same way, or are coming out of, they're not scheduled. They're coming out of like an uprising in a certain moment of like, we need to get out there. Somebody was just shot, and just kind of talking about that experience. Angela, something you were talking about, or maybe Maya was talking about it in the film, was that your son is a nurse.
Yes.
And that he's seen very differently, and how he's not, I mean, he wasn't out at the Women's March, and like the experience of a black man out in the march is very different. And I just kind of wonder how, if all of you could talk a little bit about the less, sometimes when it can't, celebratory is not possible in public space.
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, not only, you know, my son is a nurse, my son is also gay, and you know, he tells these stories about, you know, being on a bus or being in public and someone grabbing their purse just because he walks by. So it's tough. I think what many of these protests have is, oh, well, you're out here and you're angry and you're screaming, you know, how dare you? Well, we're disenfranchised and people are kicking us in the rear, so we've got to be out here and we've got to scream. I think that we have to have a voice, and sometimes that voice has to be angry, and because the only way that you'll listen is if it's an angry voice. So sometimes the protests are not pretty, they don't have, you know, pink ribbons and bows, but they're essential. You got to do them.
Sure. Yeah, I want to kind of go back to kind of the earlier conversation about public space in a way of kind of addressing your question. I think we need to recognize that public space is actually part of our democratic institution. I mean, it's written into U.S. Constitution. You know, the First Amendment, one of the 6 rights is the right for, you know, peaceful assembly, and you cannot have a peaceful assembly without public space. And you know, representative democracy doesn't always work, right? There are limits to the way institutions are set up, and public space is maybe the last line of defense. You know, when things happen, we need to be out there. We need to get, you know, have our voices heard. And it could be, you know, celebratory. It could be other, you know, way as well. But you know, no matter what, I think, you know, it's a form of our democratic expression.
So my wife is involved. Adriana Camarena is really involved with a number of different cases of families who have loved ones have been murdered by San Francisco Police Department. And when those things happen, and one of them happened right across from my house at 11 o'clock at night on February 26, 2015, when Amilcar Perez Lopez was murdered by the police. Undercover cops didn't announce themselves, just shot him dead. And so the outrage and the rage is completely legit. And what else are you going to do? It's not about partying, it's about rage. And so those moments cannot be, you know, separated from the reality of what led to them, and the necessity of standing up and being public about that, standing up with Alex Nieto, murdered by a hail of bullets on Bernal Heights after eating a burrito. You know, Mario Woods, we all saw the video out in the Bayview, and many other cases. There's a long list, and it's disgusting. It's just disgusting, the racialized violence by the police department in this city. So that needs a different kind of response. I understand that completely. I also would just say, by way of historical reference, I was super involved in the White Night riot back in May 21st, 1979, and I thought we were having a revolution. I was 22 years old. I was absolutely convinced we were having a revolution. We burned 16 squad cars. We smashed the entire front of City Hall. This was it. Revolution was happening. And I woke up the next day, and it wasn't. Everything went back to normal, and I was just like shocked. I was like, how could that be? But it did, because there's a difference between rebellion and outrage and rage and the long-term effort to change life. So I totally want the space for those moments of outrage and rage. They have to happen. They're absolutely essential as pushback on the horrible behavior that we are subjected to all the time. Other populations worse than me, obviously. But the long-term transformation that we need, I don't think you can separate it from dancing in the streets. we need to be able to go there too. And obviously a vision of the life we want to live is not merely about stopping police murder. Of course we're going to do that, but we need to have a more attractive, more holistic view of how much better life could be, or a whole lot of people are just not going to join. Even people who are pissed off about police violence aren't going to join. So.
Great. Okay, so it looks like Maya has a question.
Oh, I didn't have a question. I actually really wanted to respond to to that point regarding, you know, people coming out and being angry, because it is a constant. Every day, Black and brown lives are being laid out on the streets, and it happens all the time, and nothing's going to change unless we continue that protest and that angry, because, I mean, where are we now? Like, you know, the panel talked about the different kinds of protests that there are, and that's one of them, and it has to continue or nothing's going to change. So I just wanted to sort of follow up on that. That's all. Sorry.
Thank you, Maya. Yeah. I mean, I think about the first gay pride parades in New York and San Francisco. They were very militant. You know, talk about the white knight, and our trans brothers and sisters were getting murdered. They still are getting murdered, and you know, it's a fun celebration. But I think there was a different tone this year and last after the election. There, you know, we're just started to wake us up again. You know, where I think some folks had been not quite sleeping, but not as worried. But we're worried and angry now, let me tell you. And so pride has a whole other feeling to it these days, I think, than it has, say, when President Obama was in office. There's a question in the back.
Question in the back. Here we go.
Hi. First of all, I want to thank you all for your commitment, for the purpose, and for standing up for all the causes. My question to you is, do you see your movement kind of getting labeled as a liberal movement? And have you faced any challenges? And what is it that you're doing differently so as not to fall into that getting labeled as a liberal movement?
Yes.
I don't see it as a liberal movement. I see it as a movement, a people movement. And liberal has nothing to do with it. It's a people movement. This is about everybody. Black, white, green. I don't know. I don't.
I mean, I don't necessarily identify with the blue wave or the Democratic Party or any of that stuff personally. I could care less. Rather have them than the Republicans, clearly. But that's as far as my interest goes. We need radical social change. Neither party nor the existing governmental structures of the United States is going to provide that. The Constitution's a block to that kind of change, not a help. I'm all for having the freedom of, the Bill of Rights should be ensured no matter what future we ever create. But the idea that we have to be religiously attached to the United States Constitution is one of the weirdest fetishes of this culture that I do not understand. So I'm ready for complete revolutionary change. I've no interest whatsoever in a liberal version of the status quo. Obama was a nightmare as far as I'm concerned. So I'm not on the same page with most people that might be either on the stage or out in the audience, I'm sure.
So that's a no.
Well, I do like that you use the word movement rather than just protest. I think we need to see this as a long arc. It's a series of events. It's about organizing. It's about engaging politics. It's about all of that, in order to affect change.
All right, we have a question in the
over here.
middle left of the house here.
That's a two-part question. Do you see corporate interest leaking into this these forms of dissent? And if you do, how do we keep it out?
Okay. For sure, there's always going to be co-optation. And corporate interest is one version. You could use other expressions to describe the same logic. But we tend to have the form of sort of entrepreneurial business behavior, commodity forms, selling products, make a t-shirt for your movement and sell it, buttons, blah, blah, blah. It's so embedded in our culture that it's always present, and we're always in a state of contradictory engagement with capital and the possibility of a common life. The commons beckons us. Capitalism oppresses us. Which way are we going to go? Well, we can't go one way without the other way. They're bound together. Capital can't exist without the commons, and the commons can't exist without all the things we make under capitalism. How do we find a way to start making the world that's in common, where we start having free internet for everyone in San Francisco starting next week? We could do that. We have fiber optic in the ground owned by the city. Why not? Why do we keep taking a shit in the drinking water? Why don't we start redoing the plumbing of the whole city? How would we do that? There's all kinds of deep questions to ask about how to reorganize how we behave, how we produce life. We don't very often get the conversation going. And the idea that we're co-opted, of course we are. Of course we are. Everything we do is co-opted right now. But we could start to identify that and pull those threads apart and recognize that we have choices to go in ways away from that co-optation rather than embracing it or not even noticing it.
Question over here.
Hello. My question's, I guess, kind of geared towards Chris. I was wondering if you saw any kind of connection in the informal protest activity of, critical mass rides and other movements in like the urban planning field towards informality. Like you hear a lot about like tactical urbanism and things like that, and kind of those being forms of protest that activate spaces for a commons. And do you see any lines connecting those?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Definitely, if you trace the sort of long trajectory, critical mass comes out directly out of the anti-war and anti-nuclear movements of the 70s and 80s, bicycle activism that percolated sort of underground for most of that era. Very few people were involved, but there were people keeping the flames alive, and a lot of us were just using our bicycles because that was the obvious thing to do. But the sort of tactical urbanism concept has certainly emerged side by side with that, as well as guerrilla street theater activities and all sorts of kind of guerrilla gardening, guerrilla grafting. I mean, put a gorilla in front of most anything you want, and somebody's doing it for a good reason. And that, I think, the idea is that there's a way to take initiative from below, outside of the logic of formal organizations, formal parties, or institutions, and that's difficult to sustain over time. So the big question for all anarchistic politics, I won't call it anarchist because most of it's not identified as anarchist, and I don't really either, but I think most of us are more attracted to anarchistic politics because it's horizontalist, because it's open, it's sort of hostile to, or at least suspicious of, leaders in a way that's a healthy suspicion. Like, you don't get to just make the decisions for us anymore. We're gonna do it together. And so that kind of logic permeates our culture. The Occupy movement, which spread to 1,600 cities around the United States. Of course, there was international dimension to that as well. There was a woman named Ellie Blue in Portland who was traveling around from Occupy to Occupy during that time. She's a big bike activist and a feminist author of books about women and bicycling. And she found critical mass activists at the heart of almost every Occupy movement around the United States, because these were the people who'd already been in practice doing horizontalist politics, where everybody was invited and we'll work it out together in the moment. And so I think that this logic is right there, ready for us to use. And we haven't thought of a good way to use it today, right this minute, for the next round of stuff, but we will.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jeff, we were talking about tactical urbanism and its potential impacts on structure, on policy, on the way that cities are run and public spaces are produced and before the show.
Yes. I think connecting to an earlier question about corporate co-optation, I think we need to be vigilant about kind of what tactical urbanism is turning into. It's something that is being co-opted by developers and political establishment and things like that. So I think that's something we need to be kind of vigilant about as well. But I think I want to go back to this question about how these kind of informal gathering have a sort of political kind of implication as well, in like Occupy and critical mass, and also in Hong Kong, the people who were involved with the umbrella movement, and some of them were also involved in the early Reclaim the Streets movement in Hong Kong, and that's where they cut their teeth, right? Where they knew how to organize engage in tactics, and that became amplified during the umbrella movement. So I think there's we need to study this connection as well.
Question in the back.
There's a question in the back.
Hey everybody, thanks Robin for an amazing festival. I'm Misha, the director of the Women's March film, and actually I have a question for Angela. One of the questions we've gotten every time we've shown the film is, what was the difference that the Women's March actually made? And there's always this kind of impatience for, did this make a difference? And someone mentioned the election already, and the victories that we saw, but I think on a personal level is how it made a difference for so many people, whether it was reactivating them or giving them energy for the first time. And the question for Angela is, what was the Women's March for you in terms of how did it serve as a catalyst in your life over these last couple of years? We've talked a couple of times, but what's happened since then for you since participating in that?
It totally reactivated me. I left that march so excited and so ready to take on the world, and initially I thought, okay, this march will be it, and then I realized, no, we're going to need to do this more, and we're going to need to do this more. So I started volunteering. I started, joining groups and doing these amazing things, making phone calls, working with candidates. Anything that I could do that would bring about change. That's what happened for me. My daughter, she's one room away, and I go, Maya, we should, and she's like, Mom, calm down. We're gonna do it. And I wanted to do it all at once. It's just signing up for everything, being involved with everything. That's what has done for me. I look at my calendar now and I'm going, okay, I'm going to be here, 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 and here, and I'm going to do this, and we're going to get this done. So yeah, and I feel accomplished. I feel like it's a slow process, but we're getting a lot done, and I feel like I'm a part of it, and that feels fantastic.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question. Anyone out there? Yes.
I hesitate to ask this, but in that film Hardware or whatever it was called, the woman had this rolled up poster that I noticed a Jewish star on, and she never unfurled the poster, and I was wondering, does anybody have any idea? I was hoping that there was some kind of like, oh, we're all in this together, and I had something about Judaism and something about Islam or whatever, but I've been to enough of these marches where it's been used as such a wedge issue that it just made me really nervous. And I'm wondering, does anybody know what was on that poster?
Well, yeah, so our filmmaker, Chantre Pinckney's here, so can address that question directly. Come give you a mic, Chantre. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Well, yes, so when we devised like a put down what the character was going to draw or write down, it was what the singer, actress, model wanted to put down, and actually open up for, like, this isn't everybody's problem. This is a problem for everybody. Like, this is Black Lives Matter, this protest, this involves everybody. And that's basically why, and just to include everybody, it just has much of a say. Well, it's important to have that dialogue within that for everybody to speak about this. It's a people problem, human problem, and we're involving people in it. So yeah, for that.
So solidarity and allyship, yeah. I think, is something that comes through really strongly. Thank you, everyone, for joining us to kick off the 5th annual San Francisco Urban Film Fest.